Martin Murray has called out Chris Eubank Jr. following Eubank's 10th round stoppage win over Reno Quinlan on the weekend. I'm going to quote Martin Murray here. He took to Instagram and also Twitter to call out Eubank Jr. So as you can see on screen, Martin Murray says, "Congrats to at Chris Eubank Jr. on his win last night. I've heard that he didn't look too good though and struggled against an 11-fight novice. He's a good fighter but doesn't have the power at world level and is overrated in my opinion. Would love that fight, and if it happens, he'd be beat. It's as simple as that." So those are the words of Martin Murray. Now, there have been quite a few people who I've seen online share Martin Murray's sentiments about Chris Eubank Jr.'s performance. They didn't think he looked particularly good. And as I said in my post-fight video, I will say that he didn't flow the way that he normally flows in fights. But I want to give some credit to Reno Quinlan for that, because styles make fights. I know a lot of you are probably sick of hearing that, but I really do think it applies in this situation. Guys who come forward at Chris Eubank Jr. with a high guard and squared up shoulders are exactly the kind of guys he's going to look good against, because he can get off the uppercut, which is his favorite punch, as we all know, very easily. It slots perfectly in between those guys who come forward with a square shoulders and high guard. It slots perfectly up in between their guard. And he can get the hooks off and all that kind of stuff. He doesn't throw that many straight right hands. Eubank Jr. is a guy who throws a left jab at long range, but he prefers to be at mid-range and close range a lot of the time. So against a guy who's going to fight a bit more side on and keep his distance, especially a guy who is, competent or actually world level, I think he's going to have issues. Martin Murray showed in the Arthur Abraham fight that he can actually box a little bit, moving around. He even showed it in spots against Gennady Golovkin. So I wouldn't underestimate Martin Murray's ability to fight at long range. Primarily, though, he is a guy that comes forward behind a high guard and applies pressure. And that would play into Chris Eubank Jr.'s hands. So I think if Murray was to fight Eubank Jr., a lot would depend on how Martin Murray decided to approach that fight. If he approached it with a view to applying pressure like the typical Martin Murray, I think that would play into Eubank Jr.'s hands. But if he tried to box a bit more and be technical, I think if Martin Murray is going to win the fight, that's how he would do it. Now, the critiques that he has about Eubank, he says he doesn't have power at world level. I also agree that, particularly at super middleweight, Eubank Jr. hasn't really shown much power. I mean, he's only had one fight at super middleweight, but you have to assume moving up in weight that his power, whatever power he did have at middleweight, is going to be less effective at super middleweight against the bigger guys. Eubank Jr. says he walks around just over 170 pounds. So he's a small super middleweight. Let's not get it twisted. Medium-sized super middleweight at best. But Martin Murray himself isn't a puncher. He certainly wasn't a puncher at middleweight, and he's definitely not a puncher at super middleweight. So it would be two average, mediocre punchers fighting each other at super middleweight. Eubank Jr. versus Murray. But Eubank Jr. is a lot faster than Murray. He's got the youth on his side. I think he's got a better work rate. I think he is a lot more explosive, a better combination puncher. But Martin Murray has the experience on his side. He's been in there with Golovkin. He's been in there with Sergio Martinez, George Groves, countless other people. Arthur Abraham. And I think that he understands the science of boxing, the chess element of boxing, the technique element of boxing better than Eubank Jr. does at this stage. Eubank Jr. is in love with his athleticism, and I think his dad is as well. I think one of the reasons why his dad is so gassed about his son is not just because it's his son, not just because it's his product that he's promoting, but also because of his son's athleticism, because he does have incredible athleticism. If you see the way he trains in the gym, any of you have seen those videos that he's posted to social media, you can't help but be impressed by the hand speed and the combinations he throws on the bag and all that kind of stuff on the pads. But athleticism is one thing. You can't reach the very top of the game unless you're a Roy Jones Jr., who was just an absolute freak athlete. Unless you're a Roy Jones Jr., you're not going to reach the top in boxing and stay at the top, trading only on athleticism. And that's what Eubank Jr. appears to be doing at this stage. Obviously, he's picked up some technique and he's picked up a certain amount of experience in the ring, which he can use going forward. But I still feel, just looking at the Quinlan fight, that his game is very, very unpolished. And Martin Murray may be able to do certain things in there. Again, if he approaches the fight from a technical point of view, like behind a stiff jab, keeping it long, so on and so forth. He just keeps it simple, kind of like the way Badou Jack fought against James DeGale. If he fights that kind of style, maybe keeps it long more than Badou Jack did, though. You know, behind the jab, but technical, doesn't try and do anything fancy, takes his time and just waits for Eubank to throw the shots and then exploits his mistakes, particularly with the jab and particularly with body shots. If he's able to do that, then Martin Murray, I think, does have a chance of winning the fight. But Murray is, 35, 36 years old now. He did fight recently, I think it was in December in Monte Carlo, on that show with Luis Ortiz and what have you. So he hasn't been too inactive. But he is a bit shot-worn now. He did have a punishing fight against George Groves, where he was hurt badly in that fight several times and took a lot of punishment. And Eubank Jr. is fresh. So if the fight were to get made next, or anytime this year actually, I'd be leaning towards Chris Eubank Jr. to win the fight on points. Even though Martin Murray may have the experience and so on and so forth, I do feel, as I say, he's a bit long in the tooth now, a bit shot-worn, had a lot of hard fights, and Eubank Jr.'s exuberance, his energy, and his fitness would probably get him through a tough fight against Murray. I don't think it would be easy for Eubank Jr. if he was to fight Martin Murray, particularly not in the first half of the fight. The longer it goes, I would expect Eubank Jr. to get his second win, even if the first half has been a tough affair. I would expect him to get his second win in the second half of the fight and really go to town on Martin Murray. But early on, he might have problems with Murray's know-how and his veteran moves. So it's an interesting fight. And considering that Chris Eubank Jr. isn't really a world champion, and I'm going to stay on that line because, yes, the IBO belt has been held by all these different people, but it's been held by all those different people because the IBO have, I don't want to say forced their belt upon all these different fighters, but they've kind of gate crashed the party. Whenever you have unifications, the IBO have come along and said, hey, fight for our belt as well. You know, it's not really a belt that you find top level fighters fighting for on its own. And if you go to the websites of the WBA, the IBF, the WBC and the WBO, all of those organizations recognize each other as legitimate sanctioning bodies. You'll see them list the other organizations and the champions of the other organizations on their websites, but none of them list the IBO. None of them. So the IBO is not a legitimate sanctioning body, and Eubank cannot engage in unifications with the IBO belt if the other sanctioning bodies don't recognize the IBO. He won't be treated as if he's unifying by those other organizations. And he won't be treated as if he's unifying at a negotiating table. This is the issue. Eubank Jr. is actually ranked in a top 10, I believe it's in the top 10 of the WBA, I believe, at super middleweight, which just further goes to show that the IBO is not a recognized sanctioning body. Because normally, those main four sanctioning bodies do not rank champions of the other sanctioning bodies that they recognize within their top 10 contenders or top 15. They don't rank them. They just recognize them as champions and they don't rank them in their particular rankings. Occasionally it happens. In exceptional circumstances, you'll get a champion being ranked as usually the mandatory challenger within a different organization's rankings, but that's to try and help a unification happen. For example, it happened when Golovkin was the WBA, IBF, I think, champion, and the WBC really, really wanted this unification between Canelo and Golovkin to happen. In fact, before that, it was Miguel Cotto and Golovkin. They really wanted it to happen, so they decided to do something which is very unusual, and I believe it's WBC are the first people to start doing this. They started ranking, or they did rank Gennady Golovkin as the mandatory challenger for the WBC belt, even though he already had a WBA and IBF. But these are exceptions rather than the rule. That has happened a couple of times with the WBC because they've been desperate to consolidate their champion, to consolidate the belts, to have the unifications and to work for the betterment of boxing in those instances. But generally speaking, as I say, the four main sanctioning bodies, WBC, IBF, WBA, and WBO, do not have the champions of the other organizations listed in their rankings. They don't. Yeah, they recognize them as champions, but they don't list them with all the contenders. So anyway, that was a bit convoluted there, people. Sorry about that, but I did want to clear that up because some people do nitpick things I say in these videos. But yeah, back to the point at hand here. Martin Murray versus Chris Eubank Jr. Could it happen? Will it happen? How do you think it would go if it did happen? Who would you be picking? Is it a good next step for Chris Eubank Jr.? I personally think it is, because how many people right now are calling Chris Eubank Jr. out? Very few. And it's not because they're afraid of him, obviously, but I just don't think too many people see him as that relevant or take him particularly seriously at the moment. Now, he's saying that he's the new money. His dad is saying that he's the new money because they've got this deal with ITV. But we don't know how well this ITV box office show has done yet. And based on how well or how badly it's done, ITV will plan their next move with the Eubanks. Will ITV put up enough money for the Eubanks to secure a big opponent who's promoted by one of the major promoters out there? Will they do that based on how the last show with Eubank fighting Renault Quinlan did? We just don't know. We have to wait and see. It's a waiting game at this stage. So until that happens, if it is a success, if it was a roaring success financially, and ITV are willing to put up some serious money for Eubank Jr.'s next fight, then maybe that word will get out on a grapevine in the world of boxing, and some big names will start calling Eubank Jr. out. But until then, he's going to have to start calling, or he's going to have to continue calling other people out. Because no one at the moment, certainly James DeGale's not clamoring to fight him. George Groves ain't clamoring to fight him at the moment. Those are guys at super middleweight. Callum Smith ain't clamoring to fight him. The guys at middleweight, Billy Joe Saunders, as far as we know, ain't clamoring to fight him. Golovkin needs challenges, so we'll see what happens with the Golovkin situation. But I say all that to say this: Martin Murray might be Eubank's best option for his next fight. Martin Murray's kind of at a crossroads point of his career where he's looking for opportunities. He's unlikely to get an opportunity against any of the current super middleweight world champions. So a Eubank Jr. fight makes sense for him. That could be likely. And if there's nobody else willing to fight Eubank at this point, if there's nothing else on the table, then yeah, I'll say the Murray fight is cool. So let me know what you think about it. It's Hatman, I'm out.